The cemetery sat on a dusty hill overlooking Fort Yuma, California, where the Colorado River bent like a broken promise. And Helena Turner visited her husband's grave every single day at dawn, carrying fresh wildflowers she picked from the rocky terrain, despite the whispers that followed her like tumbleweeds through the narrow streets. The year was 1878, and 3 years had passed since Thomas Turner died saving a child from a runaway wagon, his body crushed under the wheels while the town cheered him as a hero for exactly 1 week before forgetting his name entirely. Helena was 24 years old now, her dark hair always pinned back severely, her mourning black never abandoned despite the other women clucking their tongues and suggesting it was time to move forward. She worked at the general store, counting coins and wrapping parcels, her fingers quick and efficient, her smile rare as rain in the Arizona desert that sprawled just beyond the town limits. The store owner, Mrs. Patterson, tolerated her melancholy but made pointed comments about young widows needing to rejoin the living, about how Thomas would want her to be happy, about how unnatural it was for a woman to cling to death when life still stretched before her. The mockery started small. A comment here, a raised eyebrow there, the way conversation stopped when Helena entered the church or the dry goods store. But it grew bolder as months turned into years, as Helena refused every suitor who awkwardly appeared at her doorstep with flowers or fumbling compliments. She had loved Thomas with everything she possessed, and that love did not simply evaporate because his heart had stopped beating. She spoke to him still, at his graveside, telling him about her days, about the changing seasons, about how the river ran low this year, and how the army fort expanded its barracks to house more soldiers heading west. Old Man Crawley finally said it loud enough for everyone to hear one Sunday after services. "That Turner woman is touched in the head, talking to stones and wasting her youth on a corpse. It is unnatural, unhealthy, and frankly disturbing to witness. Someone should tell her that her husband is rotting in the ground, not listening to her pathetic daily reports." The words hit Helena like physical blows as she stood near the church steps, her hands clutching her worn Bible, her face burning with humiliation as others nodded in agreement or looked away uncomfortably. She lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and walked past them all without a word, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust as she made her way down the unpaved main street toward her small rented room above the general store. That was the morning Owen Jennings rode into Fort Yuma, his horse tired and dusty from the long journey across the desert, his saddlebags packed light because he had learned years ago that a man carried his burdens inside, not strapped to a horse. He was 27, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of whiskey in lamplight. His jaw carried stubble because shaving on the trail was a luxury, and his clothes were worn but clean, the mark of a man who took pride in himself despite circumstances. He had been a ranch hand, a trail guide, a temporary lawman in towns too small to remember, and now he was simply passing through, looking for work that might keep him in one place long enough to feel like something other than a tumbleweed. He dismounted outside the saloon, tied his horse to the hitching post, and noticed the woman in black walking quickly down the street, her face set in an expression of carefully controlled pain. Something about the rigid set of her shoulders, the determined pace of her steps, caught his attention and held it. She looked like someone fighting a battle nobody else could see, and Owen recognized that look because he saw it in his own mirror whenever he stopped long enough to glance at his reflection. The saloon was dim and relatively quiet at this early hour, just a few men nursing drinks and discussing cattle prices and railroad expansions. Owen ordered whiskey, drank it slowly, and listened to the conversations swirling around him. It did not take long before someone mentioned the Turner widow, the crazy woman who spent her life talking to a dead man, who refused to accept reality, who was an embarrassment to decent folk trying to build a respectable town in the harsh desert landscape. She loved him that much. Owen asked the bartender, a portly man with thinning hair and a stained apron. "I suppose so," the bartender replied, wiping down the scarred wooden counter. "Thomas Turner was a good man, died a hero, but that was 3 years back. Most folks think she should have moved on by now. There is loyalty, and then there is obsession. You understand? She is young enough to remarry, have children, build a new life. Instead, she wastes away talking to a headstone like it might answer her back." Owen tossed a coin on the counter and left without responding, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. He walked through town, noting the army fort looming on one side, the river glinting in the morning sun on the other, the mix of adobe buildings and wooden structures that made up this settlement on the edge of civilization. He found the cemetery easily enough, following the path that wound up the hill, and there she was, kneeling beside a simple wooden cross, her lips moving in quiet conversation, her hands placing fresh desert marigolds on the grave. He did not approach, did not interrupt, but he watched from a respectful distance as Helena Turner honored her dead husband with a devotion that made Owen's throat tighten unexpectedly. His own father had been a Texas Ranger, killed by outlaws when Owen was 15, and his mother had remarried within 6 months, choosing survival over sentiment in a world that did not offer women many choices. Owen had never blamed her, but he had never forgotten how quickly his father's memory seemed to fade from their household, how his stepfather insisted they not speak of the dead, how grief became something shameful rather than sacred. Helena finished her visit, stood slowly, brushed dust from her black skirt, and turned to find a stranger watching her from beneath the shade of a scraggly mesquite tree. Her eyes widened slightly, her hand moving instinctively to her throat in a defensive gesture, and Owen immediately stepped forward with his hands visible and empty. "I apologize for intruding, madam," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I did not mean to startle you. I am new to town and was just walking, found myself here." Helena studied him carefully, taking in his worn boots, his honest face, the way he kept his distance without crowding her. "This is a public cemetery," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "You have every right to be here." "I overheard some talk in town," Owen continued, unsure why he felt compelled to say this to a complete stranger. "About you visiting every day, about people thinking it's strange." Her expression closed immediately, her jaw tightening, her eyes flashing with a mixture of hurt and defiance. "I suppose you have opinions about that as well, like everyone else in this town. Actually, I think it is the most honorable thing I have witnessed in a long time," Owen said quietly. "Loyalty that survives death is rare. Most people forget as soon as the dirt is thrown over the coffin. You love him still, and there is nothing shameful in that." Helena stood absolutely still, staring at this dusty stranger who spoke words she had not heard in 3 years, words that made her eyes burn with unshed tears, and her chest ache with something that felt almost like hope. "You do not know me," she whispered. "You do not know anything about me or my marriage or my grief." "You are right," Owen agreed, "but I know what it looks like when someone understands that death does not erase obligation. My father died protecting others, same as your husband from what I gather. My mother moved on quickly, and I understand why, but I never forgot how it felt to have his memory treated like something inconvenient. You keep his memory alive, and that takes strength, not weakness." A tear escaped down Helena's cheek before she could stop it, and she quickly wiped it away with an impatient gesture. "The whole town thinks I am insane." "Then the whole town is wrong," Owen said simply. "And cowardly besides, to mock a widow for loving her husband. Seems to me they are uncomfortable because your loyalty makes them examine their own lack of it." Helena let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as years of held-back emotion threatened to overflow. Owen did not move closer, did not try to comfort her physically, but his presence felt solid and understanding in a way that made Helena feel less alone than she had in 3 long years. "What is your name?" she asked when she could speak again. "Owen Jennings." "I am just passing through, looking for work, maybe a reason to stay somewhere longer than a season." "Helena Turner," she replied, though he clearly already knew. "I work at the general store if you need supplies. And thank you, Mr. Jennings. Your words were kind." "They were true," Owen corrected gently. "There is a difference." Helena walked down the hill toward town, and Owen remained at the cemetery, standing before Thomas Turner's grave, reading the simple inscription carved into the wooden cross. He spoke aloud, feeling slightly foolish but compelled nonetheless. "Your wife loves you still. You were fortunate to have that, and she is fortunate to have known that kind of love. I will not bother her, but I wanted you to know that someone sees her devotion for what it is, something beautiful, not something broken." The desert wind whispered through the sparse vegetation, hot and dry, carrying the scent of creosote and dust, and Owen turned away, heading back down the hill into Fort Yuma's Main Street, where he found a boarding house and rented a room by the week, then went looking for work at the various ranches and businesses that kept this desert town alive. He found employment at the livery stable, mucking stalls and shoeing horses, hard physical labor that paid enough to cover his room and meals with a little left over. The work suited him, honest and straightforward, and the stable owner was a taciturn man who did not ask unnecessary questions or spread gossip. Owen settled into a routine, rising early, working until his muscles ached, eating simple meals at the boarding house, and occasionally stopping by the general store for tobacco or soap, always polite to Helena when their paths crossed, never pushing for conversation but never avoiding her either. Helena found herself watching for him, noticing when he entered the store, feeling something flutter in her chest that she immediately felt guilty about, because she was Thomas's wife, even if Thomas was gone. But Owen never treated her with pity or judgment, never looked at her like she was crazy or pathetic, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk beyond simple transactions. He mentioned growing up in Texas, working various jobs across the territories, never quite finding a place that felt like home. She told him about marrying Thomas at 18, about their plans to start a ranch, about how those dreams shattered under wagon wheels on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. "You think I am wasting my life?" Helena asked him one afternoon when the store was empty except for them, her hands smoothing brown paper around a parcel of flour with practiced efficiency. Owen considered the question seriously, leaning against the counter, his hat in his hands. "I think you are honoring a promise you made when you married him. For better or worse, until death do you part. But I also think that Thomas, if he loved you the way you clearly loved him, would not want you to stop living entirely. There is a difference between remembering and refusing to exist beyond memory." "Everyone wants me to forget him," Helena said, her voice breaking slightly. "To pretend those 6 years meant nothing, to smile and flirt and become someone's new wife like Thomas was just a chapter I finished reading." "That is not what I am saying," Owen replied carefully. "Keep loving him. Keep visiting his grave. Keep talking to him if it brings you comfort. but maybe also allow yourself to eat a meal without guilt, to laugh if something strikes you as funny, to notice when the sunset turns the river gold. You can honor the dead without becoming a ghost yourself. Helena looked at him with eyes that held 3 years of tears, and something shifted between them, subtle as a change in wind direction but just as significant. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "You do not even know me." "Because I have been drifting for 12 years, and I think I finally understand why," Owen said quietly. "I have been looking for something real, something that matters, something worth staying for. Your loyalty, your love, your refusal to let the world tell you what to feel, that is real. And I admire it more than I can properly express." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to fully acknowledge, and then Mrs. Patterson bustled in from the back room, breaking the moment with complaints about delayed shipments and unreliable freight companies. Owen purchased his tobacco, tipped his hat politely, and left Helena with racing thoughts and a confusion of emotions she was not prepared to examine. That Sunday, Old Man Crawley made another public declaration after church services, his voice carrying across the dusty square where people gathered before dispersing to their homes. "That Turner woman brings shame to this town with her unnatural mourning. It has been 3 years, and still she parades her widow's weeds like a banner, making the rest of us uncomfortable with her morbid dedication to a corpse. Someone should inform her that decent Christian women do not behave this way, do not make a spectacle of grief, do not waste their productive years on the dead." Helena stood frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling as the words struck her like fists, and then Owen stepped forward from where he had been observing from the outskirts of the gathering. He was not a churchgoer particularly, but he had walked past that morning and heard the commotion. "With respect, sir, you are speaking ignorance dressed up as righteousness," Owen said clearly, his voice carrying across the square without shouting. "Mrs. Turner honors her marriage vows in the truest sense, loving her husband beyond death, keeping his memory alive when the rest of you apparently have the loyalty of mayflies. If her devotion makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should examine why fidelity strikes you as unnatural, rather than criticizing a woman who understands commitment better than most." Shocked silence followed Owen's words, heads turning between him and Crawley, murmurs rippling through the gathered crowd. Crawley's face reddened with anger and embarrassment, his jowls quivering as he sputtered. "And who are you to lecture this town? Some drifter who arrived last week with nothing but a tired horse and empty pockets." "I am someone who recognizes honor when I see it," Owen replied calmly, "and someone who believes that mocking a widow says far more about the mocker than the mourner. Mrs. Turner has done nothing wrong, and this town should be ashamed for treating her devotion as something shameful." Helena stared at Owen with wide eyes, something breaking open inside her chest, years of defensive walls cracking under the weight of being defended, being seen, being understood. No one had stood up for her since Thomas died. No one had challenged the whispers and judgments, and here was this stranger, this drifting cowboy, risking the town's disapproval to speak on her behalf. The crowd dispersed awkwardly, unsure how to respond, and Helena found herself walking toward Owen on shaking legs, her breath coming quick and shallow. "You did not have to do that," she managed to say. "Yes, I did," Owen replied simply. "Because it was right, and because you deserve better than their cruelty." "They will turn on you now, too," Helena warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "They will call you names, question your character, make your life here difficult." Owen shrugged, a slight smile touching his lips. "I have been called worse and lived harder places. Their opinions do not much concern me, but yours does. Are you angry that I spoke up? Angry, Helena repeated. And then suddenly she was crying, tears streaming down her face as all the pent-up emotion of 3 years came pouring out. I am grateful. I am so grateful I can hardly breathe. No one has defended me. No one has understood. And you, who barely know me, stood up when everyone else turned away. Owen stepped closer, still careful, still respectful, and offered her his handkerchief. Helena took it, pressed it to her face, breathing in the scent of soap and leather and something distinctly masculine that she had not allowed herself to notice in 3 years. When she finally composed herself enough to look at him again, Owen was watching her with an expression of such gentle understanding that her heart lurched painfully. "Walk with me," he asked softly. "Just to the river, away from prying eyes." Helena nodded, unable to speak, and they walked together through Fort Yuma streets, past the army fort where soldiers drilled in the heat, past the collection of adobe homes and wooden buildings, down to where the Colorado River flowed wide and muddy, its banks lined with willows that provided precious shade in the relentless desert landscape. They sat on a fallen cottonwood log, not touching but close enough to feel each other's presence, and watched the water move past, carrying silt and secrets toward the distant ocean. Helena twisted Owen's handkerchief between her fingers, struggling to find words for feelings she was terrified to name. "I loved Thomas completely," she finally said, her voice steady despite the tears still drying on her cheeks. "When he died, I felt like half of myself was torn away. Everyone kept saying time would heal, that I would move on, but I did not want to heal if healing meant forgetting him." "Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Owen said quietly. "Love that deep does not just evaporate, it becomes part of who you are." "But lately," Helena continued, the words coming faster now, "I have been feeling guilty because I have been thinking about you, looking forward to seeing you at the store, feeling something I have not felt in 3 years, something that feels like waking up after a long sleep. And it terrifies me because I still love Thomas, but I also feel something for you, and I do not know how to reconcile those two truths." Owen was silent for a long moment, watching the river, his jaw working as he chose his words carefully. "I do not think you have to reconcile them. Love is not a finite resource that runs out when you give it to one person. You love Thomas, you still love his memory, and that does not diminish or prevent you from feeling something for someone else. He is gone, Helena. You are still here, and living is not betraying him." "How can you be so wise about this?" Helena asked, turning to look at him fully. "How can you understand what I am feeling when I barely understand it myself?" "Because I have spent 12 years running from connections, telling myself I did not deserve to settle down, that I was honoring my father by staying unattached and free," Owen admitted. "But the truth is I was just scared. Scared of caring and losing again. Scared of building something that could be destroyed. And then I came to this town and saw you kneeling at that grave, and I realized that you are brave in a way I have never been. You loved completely despite knowing it could end. You grieved openly despite people judging you. And you kept your heart capable of feeling even when it would have been easier to close it off entirely." Helena reached out slowly, her hand finding Owen's where it rested on the log between them, her fingers tentatively lacing with his. The touch felt monumental, the first time she had voluntarily reached for another man since Thomas died, and Owen held still, barely breathing, letting her control the contact. "I do not know what this is," Helena whispered. "I do not know what I am ready for, or what you want, or how to move forward without feeling like I am abandoning everything I built with Thomas." "Then we figure it out slowly," Owen suggested, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. "No expectations, no pressure, Just two people who understand loyalty and loss trying to find their way towards something that feels like hope. Helena nodded, fresh tears spilling over, but these felt different, cleaner somehow, like rain washing dust from windows. They sat by the river until the sun climbed high and the heat became oppressive. And then they walked back to town together, still holding hands, aware that people would see and talk but no longer caring quite so much what those judgments might be. The next morning, Helena visited Thomas's grave as always, carrying desert wildflowers, kneeling in the dust, speaking quietly to the wooden cross that marked where his body rested. But this time she told him about Owen, about feeling torn between honoring the past and allowing herself a future, about being scared and hopeful in equal measure. "I will always love you," she said softly, tracing the carved letters of his name with her fingertips. "You were my first love, my husband, my partner in all those dreams we never got to fulfill. But I am still alive, Thomas. I am still here. And I think, if our positions were reversed, you would want me to keep living to find happiness again, to not spend my whole life talking to a grave. So I am asking your permission, even though you cannot answer, even though I know that sounds foolish. I am asking if it is acceptable to open my heart again, to let someone in, to try building something new while still honoring what we had." The desert wind blew hot across the cemetery, rustling through sage and creosote, and Helena chose to interpret that as answer enough. She placed the flowers carefully, kissed her fingertips and pressed them to the cross, and walked back down the hill with something that felt almost like peace settling over her shoulders. Owen was waiting at the base of the hill, leaning against the cemetery fence, his hat pulled low against the climbing sun. He straightened when he saw her, searching her face for signs of distress, relaxing when she offered him a small, genuine smile. "I told him about you," Helena said as she approached. "About us, whatever this is becoming. I needed him to know that I am not forgetting him, just trying to live alongside the grief instead of drowning in it." "And how do you feel?" Owen asked gently. "Scared," Helena admitted. "But also lighter somehow, like I have been holding my breath for 3 years and finally remembering how to exhale." They walked back to town together, and over the following weeks and months, they built something careful and real between them. Owen continued working at the livery stable, saving his wages, making a place for himself in Fort Yuma, despite the initial resistance from townsfolk, who sided with Crawley's judgments. Helena kept her job at the general store, kept visiting Thomas's grave each morning, but she also began accepting Owen's invitations for walks by the river, for simple meals at the boarding house dining room, for conversations that stretched long into the evening as they discovered each other's histories and hopes. There was no dramatic declaration of love, no sweeping romantic gesture, just a slow and steady building of trust and affection between two people who had both known loss and understood the value of genuine connection. Owen told her about growing up wild in Texas, about his father's death and his mother's quick remarriage, about the years he spent drifting because nowhere felt like home without the family he had lost. Helena told him about her childhood in Missouri, about moving west with her parents who died of cholera the first winter, about meeting Thomas at 19 and falling hard for his steady kindness and big dreams. "He wanted to raise horses," Helena said one evening as they sat by the river watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. "He was so good with them, so patient. We were saving money to buy land to start our own ranch, and then one moment of heroism took all of that away." "He sounds like he was a good man," Owen said sincerely. "I am sorry you lost him so young, sorry your dreams got cut short." "I am sorry too," Helena replied, "but I am also grateful for the years we had." 6 years of being loved completely, of knowing what it feels like to be someone's priority, their partner, their choice. Not everyone gets that, even in long marriages. Thomas packed a lifetime of love into those 6 years. And now, Owen asked carefully, what do you want now, Helena? She turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an unexpected blessing, who understood loyalty beyond death, who defended her honor when others mocked it, who waited patiently while she navigated complicated grief. I want to try again, she said softly. I want to build something new without dismantling what I had. I want to love you, Owen, if you will be patient with me while I figure out how to do that while still honoring Thomas's memory. Owen reached for her hand, brought it to his lips, kissed her knuckles with reverent gentleness. I will be patient as long as it takes, and I will never ask you to stop visiting his grave or loving his memory. That loyalty is part of what makes you who you are, and I would not want you to change that for me or anyone. Helena leaned into him then, letting herself be held for the first time in 3 years, feeling his arms come around her with careful strength, his chin resting on top of her head as they watched the river flow past and the desert sky deepen toward twilight. It felt right in a way that did not erase Thomas, but rather made space for new possibilities alongside cherished memories. They courted properly over the next year, slow and respectful, letting the town adjust to seeing them together, letting Helena adjust to the idea of belonging to someone again. Owen proved himself over and over as a man of integrity, working hard, speaking honestly, treating Helena with a combination of respect and affection that made her feel valued and seen. He attended church sometimes just to sit beside her, weathering Crawley's disapproving glares with calm indifference. He helped her carry packages from the store, fixed the loose board on her staircase, brought her coffee on busy mornings when she worked extended hours. And every morning, without fail, Helena visited Thomas's grave, and Owen never complained or questioned or made her feel guilty for maintaining that ritual. Sometimes he went with her, standing respectfully back while she placed her flowers and had her quiet conversation, and other times he waited at the bottom of the hill, giving her privacy for that sacred time. The town eventually stopped gossiping quite so viciously, worn down by the evidence of genuine love growing between Helena and Owen, unable to maintain their judgment in the face of such obvious devotion. Mrs. Patterson even commented one day that she was glad to see Helena smiling again, that perhaps moving forward while remembering the past was the healthiest approach after all. When Owen finally proposed, 18 months after riding into Fort Yuma, he did it at Thomas's grave with Helena's permission to include her first husband in this monumental moment. They stood together before the weathered wooden cross, and Owen spoke clearly and sincerely. Thomas Turner, I am asking permission to marry your wife. I know you loved her deeply, and I promise to honor that love by caring for her with everything I have. I will never ask her to forget you or stop visiting this place. I will defend her loyalty and support her grief whenever it rises. I will build a life with her that makes space for your memory, because that memory is part of what makes her the extraordinary woman I love. I hope, wherever you are, you can grant us your blessing. Then Owen turned to Helena, pulled a simple gold band from his pocket, and dropped to one knee in the cemetery dust. Helena Turner, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love can exist beyond loss, that loyalty can expand rather than diminish, that your heart is big enough to hold both who you were and who you are becoming? Helena was crying, tears streaming down her face as she nodded vigorously, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Owen slipped the ring on her finger, stood, and kissed her gently while the desert wind whispered through the cemetery, and the morning sun climbed higher in the endless blue sky. They married in the small Fort Yuma church 3 months later, in November of 1880, with a handful of townsfolk attending, including Mrs. Patterson and, surprisingly, old man Crawley, who had apparently softened his stance after witnessing Owen's devotion and Helena's gradual return to fuller living. Helena wore a dress of deep blue rather than black, a conscious choice to honor both mourning and new beginnings, and she carried desert wildflowers in her bouquet, the same kind she had been placing on Thomas's grave for nearly 5 years. Before the ceremony, Helena visited the cemetery one final time as Helena Turner, placing flowers on Thomas's grave and speaking softly. "I am marrying Owen today. I am becoming Helena Jennings, taking on a new name, starting a new chapter. But I will never forget you, Thomas. I will never stop being grateful for the years we had. You taught me what real love looked like, and that knowledge made me brave enough to try again. Thank you for loving me so well that I could not settle for anything less than real when the time came to open my heart again. I hope you are at peace, wherever you are, and I hope you know that loving Owen does not mean I love you less." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, Owen's voice steady as he made his vows, Helena's shaking slightly with emotion but determined as she promised to love and honor this man who understood her so completely. When the preacher pronounced them married, Owen kissed his wife with tender joy, and the small gathering applauded, the sound echoing off the adobe walls and wooden beams of the frontier church. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, close enough to the cemetery that Helena could maintain her morning visits without difficulty, close enough to the river for Owen to hear the water running at night. Owen left the livery stable and took a job as a deputy sheriff, Fort Yuma having grown enough to need additional law enforcement, and Helena continued working at the general store, the two of them building a life piece by careful piece. Helena still visited Thomas's grave most mornings, though no longer every single day without exception. Sometimes she and Owen went together, placing flowers and spending a few quiet moments before heading back to breakfast. Sometimes Owen went alone when Helena was sick or working early, leaving his own small token of respect for the man whose death had eventually led to their meeting. The visits became less about clinging to the past and more about honoring it, a natural part of their routine rather than an obsessive ritual. 2 years into their marriage, Helena discovered she was pregnant, and the joy was complicated by grief because this was something she had wanted with Thomas, a dream that died with him under those wagon wheels. Owen held her while she cried, understanding without needing explanation, and together they visited Thomas's grave to share the news. "We are having a baby," Helena told the worn wooden cross, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "I wanted this with you so badly, Thomas. I wanted to give you children, to build that ranch and fill it with family. I am sorry I get to have this with someone else. I am sorry you were robbed of so much. But I am also grateful, and I will tell our child about you, about the hero you were, about how their mother learned about real love from you first." Their son was born in early spring of 1883, a healthy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's whiskey-colored eyes. They named him Thomas Owen Jennings, honoring both the past and the present, and Helena wept as she held him for the first time, overwhelmed by love and loss and gratitude all tangled together. Owen sat beside her bed, his hand gentle on her shoulder, his eyes suspiciously bright as he looked at his son, this tiny person who represented hope and continuity and the possibility of joy after sorrow. Helena took the baby to the cemetery when he was a week old, bundled against the spring wind, and introduced him to the man whose name he carried. "This is Thomas," she said softly, standing before the grave with the baby in her arms and Owen beside her. "Your namesake. He will know about you, about the man you were, about the sacrifice you made. Your memory lives on, not just in me, but in him, in the life we are building that would not exist if I had not loved you first." The years unfolded with surprising gentleness. Owen proved to be an excellent deputy, fair and firm, respected by the growing community. Helena eventually stopped working at the general store once their second child arrived, a daughter they named Grace Charlotte, and devoted herself to raising their children with stories of both bravery and love, teaching them about the uncle they never met who died a hero, about the importance of loyalty, about how love could survive even death if you honored it properly. Young Thomas grew into a serious boy who sometimes accompanied his mother to the cemetery, learning early that honoring the past was not morbid but meaningful. Grace was wilder, full of laughter, and she would dance among the graves while Helena placed flowers, singing songs that made the cemetery feel less like a place of sorrow and more like a place of memory. Fort Yuma continued growing as the railroad expanded, and the Army fort brought more commerce and settlers to the desert town. Owen eventually became sheriff, a position of respect and authority, and Helena became known not as the crazy widow who talked to stones but as the sheriff's wife, a woman of quiet strength and deep compassion who understood grief and helped others navigate their own losses. She never stopped visiting Thomas's grave, though the frequency shifted with the demands of raising children and managing a household. Sometimes she went weekly, sometimes monthly, but she never forgot, never abandoned that loyalty that had defined her for so many years. Owen never complained, never felt threatened by her continued devotion to her first husband's memory, understanding that her capacity for that kind of loyalty was exactly what made her love for him so valuable and true. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen and Helena stood together at Thomas Turner's grave, their children playing nearby, the November sun warm on their shoulders despite the season. The wooden cross had weathered and faded over the years, and Owen had carved a new one, more elaborate, with Thomas's full name and dates and the words "beloved husband, honored hero, forever remembered." "Thank you," Helena said softly, looking at the new marker, then at her husband. "For understanding, for never making me choose between honoring him and loving you." "You taught me something important," Owen replied, his arm around her waist, watching their children chase each other among the graves with innocent joy. "You taught me that loyalty does not end with death, that real love expands to make room for more love, that remembering does not mean you cannot also live. Those are lessons I will carry forever, lessons I will teach our children so they understand that commitment means something beyond convenience." Helena leaned into him, this man who had appeared when she needed him most, who understood what others mocked, who built a life with her that honored both past and future. "I love you, Owen Jennings," she said clearly. "I love you with everything I am, and that does not diminish what I felt for Thomas. It simply means my heart was bigger than I realized, capable of holding more than one great love in a lifetime." "I love you too," Owen said, kissing her temple gently. "And I am grateful every day that you were brave enough to try again, to risk your heart when it would have been safer to keep it locked away in grief." Their son Thomas came running up then, 7 years old and full of energy, demanding to know when they were going to the river for their anniversary picnic. Grace followed, 5 years old with wild dark curls in her father's eyes, chattering about the cake misses Patterson had promised to make for the celebration. Owen scooped up Grace while Helena took Thomas's hand, and together they walked down the cemetery hill toward the river, toward their future, carrying the past with them not as a burden but as a foundation for everything they were building together. The years continued their steady march forward. Young Thomas grew tall and serious, eventually following his father into law enforcement, becoming a deputy himself, and making both his parents proud with his integrity and courage. Grace married a rancher and moved to a spread outside town, giving Helena and Owen grandchildren who ran wild through the desert landscape with the same joy their mother had shown as a child. Helena's hair turned silver at the temples, then fully white, and Owen's face lined with age and sun, but their love remained steady and true. They celebrated 25 years of marriage, then 30, watching Fort Yuma transform from a rough frontier town into an established community with schools and churches and proper law. The Army fort expanded further, the railroad brought more people and commerce, and the Colorado River kept flowing, constant and unchanging while everything around it evolved. Helena still visited Thomas Turner's grave, though by now she needed Owen's arm to make the walk up the cemetery hill, her steps slower but no less determined. She brought flowers when they were available, or simply stood in quiet remembrance when the desert refused to yield blooms. Young Thomas maintained the grave marker now, replacing it again when weather wore it down, ensuring his namesake was never forgotten. On Helena's 60th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the home she and Owen had built together, she raised a glass of water in a toast. "To the men I have loved," she said clearly, her voice still strong despite her years. "To Thomas Turner, who taught me what devotion looked like and died proving that heroism is real. And to Owen Jennings, who understood that loyalty beyond the grave was not madness but honor, who built a life with me that made room for memory and love in equal measure. I am blessed beyond words to have known both of you, to have loved completely twice in one lifetime." Owen raised his own glass, his eyes bright with emotion. "To Helena, the strongest woman I have ever known, who refused to let the world tell her how to grieve or when to heal, who taught me that love is infinite if you are brave enough to keep opening your heart." Their family echoed the toasts, and the celebration continued into the evening, filled with laughter and stories and the comfortable joy of people who have built something lasting together. Later, when the guests had departed and the house was quiet, Owen and Helena sat on their porch watching the stars emerge in the desert sky, their hands clasped together, their shoulders touching. "Do you have any regrets?" Owen asked softly. "About any of it?" Helena considered the question seriously, then shook her head. "No, I regret that Thomas died so young that we did not get to fulfill our dreams together. But I do not regret loving him or grieving him or refusing to forget him. And I do not regret opening my heart to you, building this life, creating this family. Everything happened as it was meant to, painful and beautiful all tangled together. I am glad I rode into Fort Yuma that day," Owen said quietly. "Glad I found my way to that cemetery, to you, to this life we have built. You made me understand what it means to really commit to someone, to honor them even when the world judges you for it." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other against unlikely odds, who had navigated grief and judgment and built something real and lasting from the wreckage of loss. The desert night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called out, its voice echoing across the landscape that had witnessed their entire story. Helena lived to be 72 years old, passing peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1926, with Owen holding her hand and their children gathered around her bed. She died in the same small house she and Owen had built together, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, photographs of children and grandchildren covering the walls, mementos of their decades together filling every surface. Her last words were quiet, meant only for Owen, spoken with a smile. "Tell Thomas I am coming, and thank you, my love, for every single day." Owen buried Helena beside Thomas Turner, the two graves side by side on the hill overlooking Fort Yuma and the river beyond. He commissioned a stone marker for her that read, "Helena Turner Jennings, beloved wife to two good men, devoted mother, woman of unshakable loyalty, 1854 to 1926. Between the two graves he placed a bench, and there he sat most days until his own death 3 years later, talking to both of them, telling them about their children and grandchildren, about how Fort Yuma had transformed into a proper city, about how their love story had become something of a legend in the community. Young Thomas, now middle-aged and sheriff himself, buried his father between his mother and his namesake, 3 graves in a row, and commissioned a final marker that told the whole story in simple words. "Here lie 3 souls bound by love that survived death, mocked by those who did not understand, honored by those who did." The story of Helena Turner and Owen Jennings became the kind of tale parents told their children in Fort Yuma, a reminder that loyalty was a virtue, that love could survive loss, that opening your heart again after devastating grief was not betrayal but bravery. The cemetery bench remained, weathered by years of desert sun and wind, a place where people came to sit and think about their own loves and losses, about the ways grief and joy intertwined, about how the human heart could be both broken and whole at the same time. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the desert wind blew just right, locals claimed you could feel something peaceful on that hill, something that felt like old love still echoing, like loyalty that survived beyond flesh and bone, like 3 souls who had found their way to understanding that death was not an ending but a transformation. And love, real love, was eternal if you were brave enough to honor it properly.